In this video, I will be talking about the midpoint and distance formula. Before we get there, we need to talk about two things. First, congruent segments. Congruent segments are line segments that have the same length. They're usually noted by some type of hash mark like so. The second thing are coordinate points. So a point xy gives the horizontal distance x and the vertical distance y from the origin. So on this graph over here, the x coordinate gives the distance horizontal from the origin, and the y distance, the y coordinate, gives the vertical distance from the origin. So a midpoint of a segment is the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. So if we have the segment AB and we fold it in half, on that crease will be the midpoint. Midpoints split the segment into two congruent parts. So in this case, AM is congruent to MB. A segment bisector is basically the same thing, except it can also be a ray, line, line segment, or plane that intersects the segment at its midpoint. So if we have the segment AB and we fold it in half, M would be on that crease. Except the segment bisector could be a ray, it could be an entire line, or it could be a plane. A question that you might see is something that looks like this, where I ask you to solve for x, given the image. The first thing we need to do is to label what we know. From this image, we can tell that M is the midpoint of VW because VM is congruent to MW. Because of that, we know the length of VM is equal to the length of MW. So from there, we can just substitute. The length of VM is 4x minus 1, and that is equal to the length of MW, which is 3x plus 3. From here, we just need to solve this equation. So the first thing I want to do is to get all the variables to the left, and then I will get all the constants to the right. In order to do that, we're going to subtract 3x from both sides, which gives us x minus 1 on the left-hand side and 3 on the right-hand side. Then we need to get all the constants on the right-hand side, so we need to add 1 to both sides. When we do that, we get x is equal to 4, which is a perfectly reasonable answer. The next thing is a midpoint formula. So in order to find a midpoint of a line segment, we average the endpoint's distance from the origin. So if we have 2 points, x1, y1, and x2, y2, we average the horizontal distance, or the x distance, and the vertical distances, or the y distance. So on this graph, if we have this segment that starts at x1, y1, and ends at x2, y2, we can simply average the x's and then average the y's, and that'll give us our endpoint. Keep in mind that this answer is going to be a coordinate point, so it will have two things attached to it, and it will look like something like this. For example, if we want to find the midpoint of 4, -1, and 3, 6, the first thing we should probably do is to label our points. So 4, -1 is x1, y1, and 3, 6 is x2, y2. After that, we can just average the x's. So 4 plus 3 divided by 2, and then average the y's, -1 plus 6, also divided by 2. Once we plug both of those things into the formula, we can simplify. So this gives us 7 over 2 and 5 over 2, which again is a perfectly reasonable answer. The next big thing that we need to talk about is the distance formula. The distance formula is used to calculate the distance between 2 points in a coordinate plane. The distance between 2 points, x1, y1, and x2, y2, is this giant thing right here, which you should memorize. This is based off the Pythagorean theorem, but we will get to that at a later chapter. So once we have that formula down, then we can answer questions about it. So for example, if I want you to find the distance between point A and point B, first thing we need to do is to get the points correct. So point A, this red point, is 1, 3. And this point B, the blue point, is 0.4, negative 4. Once we have those figured out, we can label them x1, y1, and x2, y2. And then all we have to do is to plug into our formula. So d will equal the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So d will equal the square root of 4 minus 1 squared plus negative 4 minus 3 squared. Once we substitute in our values, all we have to do is simplify. So d will equal the square root of 3 squared plus negative 7 squared. That simplifies to the square root of 9 plus 49, which is equal to the square root of 58. And again, that is a perfectly reasonable answer. So to recap, there are 4 things we went over. First is the midpoint. The midpoint is the point that splits a line segment into 2 congruent segments. In other words, it splits a segment directly in half. A segment bisector is almost the exact same thing as a midpoint, except it can be a segment, a line, a ray, or a plane that goes through the midpoint. Then we went over 2 formulas that you should memorize. The first is the midpoint. The midpoint formula is just the average of the x values over and then the average of the y values. The distance formula is a little bit trickier, and it is one that I highly suggest you memorize by heart. So d, distance, will equal the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. That is all I have for midpoint and distance. Please go back and watch the video as needed and go through the examples. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.